Before anyone tried to make it a symbol, either of American industrial might or of battlefield controversy, the M4 Sherman was a family of medium tanks conceived to solve a brutally practical problem: how to bring mobile, reliable, and supportable armored firepower to every front line the United States expected to fight on. It was never built as a prize fighter meant to win a one-on-one spectacle under ideal lighting. It was built as a worker that could march, shoot, communicate, and be fixed forward under heat, grit, salt, rain, and deadlines. The word Sherman itself conceals a swarm of variants that shared a common philosophy more than a single frozen specification. Different power plants, from the air-cooled Wright R975 radial to the Ford GAA V8, to multibank designs, suspensions that started as vertical volute and matured into horizontal volute, and then the smoother HVSS, guns that ranged from the early 75 mm to the 76 mm high velocity, and, in specialized roles, the 105 howitzer. But beneath all the alphabet soup ran a basic idea: keep crews alive long enough to finish the mission, keep vehicles available long enough to dictate tempo, and keep the entire formation speaking to each other through dependable radios so that tanks never fought alone. Describe a Sherman in a way a mechanic would appreciate, and the puzzle begins to sharpen. The hull layout prioritized access. Panels opened, filters could be swapped, plugs could be reached without cursing. The tracks and rubber-bushed road wheels were designed with the crew's backs and the maintenance sergeant's sanity in mind. The tank could be driven hard for hours without shaking its people into mistakes. Inside, the turret gave a loader a real workflow instead of a contortionist act. The optics were good enough to put high-explosive shells exactly where platoon leaders wanted them, into field guns, bunkers, and machine gun nests that otherwise pinned infantry. Stabilization, imperfect though early systems were, nudged the platform toward quicker first shots on the move. Externally unglamorous, the package was quietly optimized to make the improbable happen: arrive on time, fire accurately enough, survive hits well enough, and be ready to do it again 24 hours later. That is the plain reality of the platform before any story about it is told. When Japanese engineers encountered it, often in the unromantic setting of a sun-blasted wreck near a captured airstrip or in a depot where stripped components lay stacked on tarps, they were not meeting a legend. They were meeting a machine. They came armed with their own mental yardsticks. How thick was the frontal glacis? What was the muzzle velocity? How many millimeters of armor could this gun defeat at this range? How far did the suspension travel before bottoming out? Those measurements mattered, and in isolation the Sherman's numbers did not shout dominance. Its armor could be perforated by well-placed shots from the right weapons. Its profile seemed tall. Its early ammunition stowage was not forgiving of penetrations. On a clean sheet of paper, a skeptical engineer could circle weak points with a pencil and wonder why such a vehicle would be pushed to the front of great operations. The reason to start with a sober definition is that it prevents sleight of hand later. There was never just one Sherman, and there was never just one war for it to fight. The same turret silhouette edging along a hedgerow in Normandy would, months later and half a planet away, be grinding up volcanic ash on Iwo Jima or coral on Peleliu. In the Pacific, where Japanese evaluators most often encountered the type, the battlefield asked for different excellence than the mythmakers of armored dueling preferred to celebrate. Infantry had to be escorted through clawing terrain. Anti-tank guns had to be silenced quickly. Pillboxes had to be cracked open, often under small arms fire from angles that looked like a nightmare blueprint. Coordination with naval gunfire and carrier air had to be instantaneous rather than elegant. The Sherman's design logic answered those demands not by winning a physics contest on a test range, but by winning the logistics and tempo contest that governed whether units lived or died. Consider, too, the ecosystem the Sherman assumed around it. Radios were not an accessory. They were a circulatory system. The tank expected friends, infantry who had been drilled to crawl behind it, engineers who knew where to place satchel charges, artillery batteries whose fire could be tuned by a few words over the net, fighter bombers waiting for a grid reference and a final check for friendlies. The tank expected recovery vehicles that would tug it away if it broke. It expected spares to be in the pipeline before the old parts had fully failed. It expected that crewmen would be trained to a standard that let different platoons function together without a week-long rehearsal. None of this fits neatly into a 3-digit figure about armor penetration, but all of it shows up on battle outcomes. Japanese engineers did not miss these things. Their notes, composed under the pressure of a deteriorating strategic position and in the shadow of industrial constraints that were tightening like a vice, capture a growing discomfort with how badly raw specifications mapped to reality. The Sherman's 75mm gun, for instance, made sense when you looked at what it was used against most of the time in the Pacific. Fieldworks and infantry positions that hated accurate, plentiful, and prompt high explosive more than they feared rare armor-piercing duels. The interior layout, almost dull in its rationality, correlated with a depressingly simple truth. Crews who could bail out lived to fight again, and crews who could find switches and handles without twisting their spines made fewer mistakes when everything went wrong. By defining the Sherman as a system rather than as a single specimen, one begins to see why it confounded the first expectations of its examiners. A medium tank by designation, it turned heavy when collocated with artillery and air, and turned light when the unit needed to cross a weak bridge or repair a broken bogie with tools from a common kit. It was easy to copy features and hard to copy the total. Japanese evaluators could sketch dimensions and estimate slopes, but they could not, in any lab, reproduce the supply chain that made those features sing together. The vehicle seemed ordinary when detached from its context, and it seemed inexorable when returned to it. This first chapter must therefore leave behind both praise and complaint, and aim for clarity. The Sherman was what it was, a generalist's tool sharpened by practice and abundance. It did not invalidate other design philosophies, nor did it escape the penalties of its own compromises. Yet it advanced with a kind of bureaucratic courage. Paperwork done right, parts cataloged, maintenance manuals honed by mechanics who hated losing time. The result, as Japanese engineers were dismayed to discover, was that the tank's mediocrity on paper often translated into sufficiency everywhere, and sufficiency, multiplied by thousands and partnered by radios and doctrine, felt like inevitability. When we speak of an admission that it shouldn't have worked, we are not accusing those engineers of naivete. We are noting an honest collision between two ways of thinking about weapons, the artisanal and the systemic. The artisanal approach exalts the singular feature that demoralizes an opponent in a duel. The systemic approach quietly biases everything toward showing up, communicating, and trying again tomorrow. A full understanding of the Sherman starts with that distinction. It is time to follow the evaluators into the field, where their rulers and micrometers had to share space with mud, shattered trees, and the non-negotiable schedules of a force that had made the decision to move, regardless of weather. There, the difference between impressive and effective would stop being academic. To understand how the Sherman became a recurring presence in Japanese engineering notes, it helps to feel the cadence of the war instead of simply listing dates. The first beat is 1943 in the Central and Southwest Pacific, when American armored doctrine, still evolving and still bruised by lessons from North Africa, begins to push the M4 into island fights where the M3 and M5 light tanks had carried the burden. At first, the tanks are few, parceled out in supports to infantry battalions, their role understood not as armored fencing, but as a rolling partner to men who needed a mobile gun, and a confident silhouette to steady their advance. Japanese observers encounter these vehicles in snapshots: a hull stranded on a reef after a landing attempt gone wrong, a turret ring jammed with grit, a bogey assembly twisted by a mine. The artifacts are imperfect instructors, but they are instructors nonetheless. And the first lesson they teach is that the vehicles are present earlier and more often than expected. The second beat is 1944, the Marianas Campaign that shudders across Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Here the timetable is merciless, imposed by a grand strategy that uses island fields to leapfrog heavy bombers toward Japan. The Shermans appear not as curiosities, but as a daily fact. They do not dominate every firefight. They suffer, burn, and break. Yet they also reappear, sometimes the very next morning, coaxed back to health by crews and ordnance men who treat recovery as part of combat rather than as an afterthought. Japanese engineers, some attached to headquarters and others in units tasked to report on enemy material, start to see patterns that turn anecdotes into evidence. A tank company that loses vehicles on Monday will throw tracks again into the fight by Wednesday. Replacement road wheels arrive in cartons. Radios crackle with a confidence that suggests not just training, but supply. Infantry yells into microphones and artillery shifts its sheaf in response. The technical notes begin to mention time and tempo with the same seriousness traditionally reserved for thickness and velocity. The third beat arrives in 1945 with the brutal logic of the Philippines and then the specter of home island defense. The shape of the war pushes Japanese evaluators into an uncomfortable two-front mental posture. On the one hand, they have to write sober reports on the geometry and metallurgy of a tank they can touch. On the other, they have to extrapolate what it means for an enemy to have standardized so many parts and procedures that units separated by oceans behave like the same unit. They follow the movement of variants, noting when 76mm guns appear, when wet ammunition stowage reduces catastrophic fires, when dozer blades and flamethrower conversions change the tactical conversation around caves and bunkers. The tempo becomes the headline. It is not simply that the enemy has this or that version, but that the version you face today is not necessarily the version you will face a month from now, and the gap between learning and fielding seems cruelly short. Within that large arc, smaller pulses matter deeply. A landing beach at dawn forces a certain choreography, tanks with deep wading kits and snorkels following the tide, crewmen peering past spray and smoke, infantry clinging to the notion that a steel hull can stand between them and machine gun fire. By noon, if the beachhead holds, there are tank tracks crossing lines of churned sand and coral that look like pale scars on a dark body. By evening, if the day has gone well, there are hasty maintenance circles around warm engines, hands dark with oil, plug wires teased free and resecured, and the smell of solvent and sweat and cooked paint. The next day repeats with maddening similarity, and the fact of repetition is itself a weapon. Japanese notes, translated into a kind of quietly pained prose, observe that the enemy's mechanical rituals are dependable enough to anchor tactics. You can predict that damaged vehicles will be replaced, that intact vehicles will have fuel, that units will not collapse simply because something went wrong at 10 in the morning. This sense of rhythm is not an aesthetic flourish, but a lens. If you imagine war as a series of isolated set pieces, the Sherman's virtues look insufficiently dramatic. If you feel war as duration, days stacked on days, marches stacked on marches, the virtues begin to glow. Radios save half an hour here, a reliable starter saves 10 minutes there, a quick release panel saves 20 minutes somewhere else, and suddenly a battalion meets its start line on time and the artillery barrage doesn't go to waste. Japanese engineers track these small salvations because they add up to outcomes their manuals warn about, the enemy that keeps time rather than the enemy that breaks records. It is in this context that the language of admission begins to seep into summaries. The tank, they note, did not humble gun for gun or plate for plate, but it humbled schedules. It made its appointments. The timeline also marks the institution's learning speed. American units that had been sloppy about ammunition storage in 1943 showed different habits and different hardware by 1944. Crews who had trusted only stationary firing begin to accept the stabilizer as a friend. Recovery and repair become a drilled duet, and those dozer blades start to appear like an engineer's punchline. Of course, the enemy attached an earth mover to his tank, because of course he wants the road to exist tomorrow morning. Against this backdrop, Japanese analysts confront a more painful heartbeat: the pulse of shortages. Steel that might have shaped a higher velocity gun is rationed for ships. Fuel that might have trained crews is spent on transports. Radio components that might have netted companies together have to be hoarded for fighters. The timeline contains not only what the enemy does, but what you cannot do in response. By the summer of 1945, when speculation about assault on the home islands presses into every technical report, whether invited or not, the timeline has taught its lesson. The tank that trundled off a landing craft in 1943, looking oddly tall and vulnerable, has turned into a harbinger of rehearsed violence. When it appears, it signals more than itself. It signals artillery with registered targets, aircraft with munitions pre-briefed, engineers with satchel charges sorted by fuse length, infantry with a rhythm to their breathing, because they have done this before, and because they can hear a voice on the radio that sounds like authority. The Japanese engineer, if he is honest, must admit that by this point specifications were the least interesting part of the problem. That admission does not erase the pain of losses inflicted on these tanks by clever gunners and brave infantry. Mines still rip bogies free, shaped charges still score miracles, ambushes still achieve sudden local superiority. The point of the timeline is not to disguise these exceptions, but to assign them their real size within the season of war. A blown track slows a platoon for an hour, an engine failure detours a company, a burnt-out hull blackens a hill. Yet the schedule keeps breathing, the battalion keeps its dates, and the landing craft show up again on another shore. The engineering notes that once measured armor angles now measure something more abstract and more terrifying: the enemy's reliability. Nothing in that word is glamorous. Everything in it is decisive. This is how the timeline anchors the rest of the story. It gives a reader a body clock against which to judge every later chapter about guns, armor, survivability, and countermeasures. When we return to specific features, the 75 mm's behavior against fieldworks, the interior ergonomics that save seconds at awkward moments, the powertrain choices that prefer availability to elegance, you will be able to set those facts against the drumbeat that made them powerful. The Sherman's history in Japanese eyes is not a blur of technicalities, but a calendar that refused to be torn up. Before the first wrench touched a foreign hull or the first caliper squeezed a foreign plate, the engineers tasked with understanding the American medium tank brought their own hierarchy of virtues to the table. This hierarchy had been shaped by doctrine, by industry, by the visible heroics of armored duels elsewhere, and by a cultural admiration for craft that solved hard problems with elegant mechanisms. At the top of the list sat a straightforward ideal: immunity by thickness and victory by velocity. If your frontal glacis could shrug off the opponent's current gun, and your own long-barrel cannon could punch through his at a responsible distance, the rest of the conversation felt like optimization rather than destiny. The heights of design were occupied by machines whose silhouettes suggested coiled force and whose gun mantlets promised contempt for anything unlucky enough to appear in their sights. Through that lens, the Sherman arrived as a kind of affront. The armor was not scandalously thin, but nor was it the rampart a conservative duelist might want. The 75mm gun, especially in its earlier ammunition regimes, broadcast a preference for high explosive bursting power over pure armor piercing, a choice that seemed to downgrade the most theatrical mission a tank could perform: killing other tanks. The profile looked tall and therefore easy to hit. The early placements of ammunition invited catastrophe if the armor was penetrated. The suspension, with its external bogies and volute springs, looked almost agricultural set against the compact torsion bars admired in other designs. Taken together, the first impression threatened to be a verdict. This was a machine optimized for the wrong contest, and therefore condemned to disappointment. An expectation is powerful precisely because it borrows the authority of common sense. If a tank duel is what decides the worth of a tank, you select for the duel. If survival in the center of the glacis is the moral test of engineering, you add plate until the sums look righteous. If fine optics and stabilization can be achieved only at the price of complexity, you think hard about whether you can afford them and whether the battlefield will reward the sacrifice. In such a framework, the Sherman's compromises read like confessions. It could be penetrated by guns that an opponent could reasonably field. It carried a weapon whose virtues shone best when the target was not another tank. It spent weight on crew space and component access that did not look like victory in a factory drawing. But the obligation of an evaluation team is to test expectations against observations. Japanese engineers did this with a seriousness that does them credit, and their notes reveal the moment when the spreadsheet of virtues begins to conflict with the diary of outcomes. The first surprise is the stubborn regularity with which the American tank appears after being destroyed. Wrecks litter the approach to an airfield, and then the same silhouettes reappear with fresh paint and a slightly different smell, as if the factory were just behind the next ridge. A destroyed unit does not imply a destroyed capacity. The machines that should have been trophies are instead merely obstacles in the way of fresh machines. The second surprise is the way infantry behave around the tank. If you believe that a tank's primary partner is another tank, you grade it accordingly. If you discover that the tank is really a midwife to infantry assaults, you must invent new criteria. The 75mm gun that seemed a downgrade becomes a scourge of machine gun nests and field guns. The coaxial and bow weapons, the smoke, the ability to absorb attention and violence while riflemen close the last 50 meters, these acquire a mathematical weight no duelist's equation contains. The ordnance notes, written in tidy script, begin to mention human effects. Pinned platoons that stand up once a tank's voice echoes over the net, strong points that cave after a few chi shells placed like taps on a chisel, ambushes that fail because someone in the turret hears something in his headphones and says 3 words that redirect a battery. A third surprise comes from inside the hull. The expectation that cramped spaces are the price of battlefield potency runs into a turret where a loader can move his arms and a driver can find his levers without bruising his knees. Ergonomics sound like softness until they are correlated with reload rates, with fewer dropped shells, with fewer mistaken gearings in the worst seconds of an engagement. The infamous stories of ammunition fires are not ignored. They are measured. Then the measurements change as wet stowage appears, and the change is not just technological, but behavioral. Crews believe they have a chance, and men who believe they have a chance behave differently under stress. A fourth surprise is the language of the maintenance reports. If perfection requires rare parts and delicate tools, perfection will perish on contact with a depot that runs on ingenuity and prayer. The Sherman does not worship rarity. Its bolts and plugs and panels admit the rough kindness of a harassed mechanic. The vocabulary of the American manuals favors procedures over artistry. You can read it and do it, and doing it returns a vehicle to duty that evening. The Japanese notes struggle to assign moral weight to this homely virtue, but they cannot ignore it. If availability is a statistic that companies fight with, then the Sherman fights with a high available rate. By the time these surprises stack high enough to cast a shadow on the old expectations, honesty demands a recalibration of what should means. Perhaps the tank should not have worked if you insist that war is a tournament of selected champions meeting on ground designed to flatter them. Perhaps the tank should work if you accept that war is instead a test of who can keep a large organism breathing while it tries to do the simplest hard things at the right hour. Japanese engineers, who loved fine machines and whose own designs showed that love, were not blind to the romance of the duel. But their task forced them into a sterner romance with reality. And reality kept repeating that this odd, ordinary-looking vehicle performed the central duties of its formation often enough, long enough, and predictably enough to matter more than its failures. What emerges from this chapter is the feel of an intellectual pivot. The evaluators do not become cheerleaders. They become better skeptics. They recast their questions. Instead of asking, "Why is the armor not thicker?" they ask, "What does thicker armor buy on these beaches at these times?" Instead of asking, "Why not a longer gun?" they ask, "What do the available targets die of in these fights?" Instead of assuming that ergonomic grace is indulgence, they test whether men who can breathe fight longer. They keep score in a new currency. The minutes saved by a radio call, the hours saved by a straightforward engine pull, the days saved by a spare parts chain that fills gaps before they are fatal. In that coin, the Sherman keeps paying. And so the idea that it shouldn't have worked becomes not a final sneer, but a starting dare. Prove that specification is destiny, and the wrecks on the beach will endorse you. Prove that tempo is destiny, and the next wave will contradict them. By now, the Japanese engineers know that the next wave is coming. The case for the tank remains imperfect, but the case against it has fallen apart in their hands. They are ready, if not eager, to cut metal and count springs and weigh plates with a different eye. The earliest serious examinations of the American medium tank in the Pacific were born less from laboratory calm than from the chaos that followed a day of fighting. A vehicle burns beside a grove of palm. The paint blisters and curls. Ammunition that did not cook off lies in the sand like ugly fruit. The scene is not the setting a draftsman would choose to meet a new design, but it is honest, and honesty is a better teacher than tidiness. Japanese teams assembled from ordnance officers, engineers, and mechanically talented soldiers move in when the shooting allows, their notebooks already grimed by the work of hauling plates and unbolting panels that heat still protects like a curse. What they seek are not trophies so much as answers. Why did this vehicle come here? What was it trying to do? What strengths and weaknesses does it reveal when reduced to parts in the climate that killed it? They begin with the skin, because the skin is available. Cuts into the glacis expose thicknesses that match or slightly vary from what manuals suggest. Slopes are measured with protractors. The memory of an impact's angle is reconstructed from visible scars and the telltale geometry of a ricochet. Welds are examined with a skeptical tenderness. If the welds are crude, the critics will pounce. If they are robust without being fussy, another conclusion begins to form. The builders valued speed under discipline, not speed under negligence. Rivets and bolts tell their own stories of panels designed to be removed without breaking an entire assembly, of access points that anticipate maintenance as a daily sacrament rather than a rare liturgy. The suspension tempts the hands next. It is older in spirit than the torsion bars some designers considered the modern way, but its virtues make themselves plain to anyone who has driven over rutted earth. The bogies articulate with a confidence that speaks to manufacturing tolerances chosen to forgive dirt and abuse. The externality of the system is not a confession of fragility, but an admission that the mechanics who will tend it should not need to crawl through a cathedral of steel to change a spring. The more the inspectors handle it, the more they appreciate the transaction embedded in the choice. Accept a little extra exposure in exchange for a lot of extra availability. Engine bays, once the heat eases, yield their secrets to wrenches and pry bars. Whether the power plant is the familiar radial or the burly V8, the way it sits in the hull invites a certain practical affection. Filters can be reached, plugs can be pulled, belts can be replaced without inventing new swear words. This is not a temple to theoretical efficiency. It is the backroom of a shop that knows tomorrow's workload. The field report that results is an odd hybrid of praise and irritation. Praise, because the system seems to have been built by men who respected the rhythm of service. Irritation, because that rhythm allows the enemy to play longer and therefore more dangerously than the raw tally of destroyed vehicles would predict. Inside the fighting compartment, after someone has taken the trouble to vent the fumes and sweep away the ash, the layout proves another argument against prejudice. The loader's corner is not an afterthought. The commander's perch can see. The gunner's world is not a punishment. Controls are where a human hand expects them to be, and levers behave like levers rather than suggestions. The evaluators do not romanticize what they find. War is not made gentle by a slightly better handle, but they record how many actions can be performed without contortion. They correlate the observation with rates of fire and with the speed at which a crew can reverse a mistake. An army that is already suffering shortages of seasoned men has to learn such lessons the hard way. Here the lesson is offered almost kindly by an enemy machine. Then there is the gun, and with it the conversation that will run like a wire through so many other pages. The 75mm tube, impressive in a hedge-busting role that Pacific combat often demanded, reveals itself to be part of a whole aimed less at dual fantasy and more at real targets. When the examiners pick through the crates left near an overrun position, they find a preponderance of high-explosive rounds. The armor-piercing allotment exists, but the story the ammunition tells is unglamorous and damning to any argument that hopes to solve the Sherman problem by building a few better tank killers. The American tank was appointed to smash field works, chase guns out of cunning hides, and make infantry move. The fragments embedded in shattered trees and the scars on concrete backs up that appointment. Radios complicate the narrative further. A burnt tank may leave behind only a husk of a set, but the frequency charts and the casual coherence with which units were heard to operate before the position fell suggest a harsh truth. The wireless is not an accessory. It is a weapon. The evaluators, trained to think of tubes and coils as precious things to be guarded and rationed, confront an enemy for whom a net reaching from platoon to battery to aircraft is as much a matter of doctrine as of hardware. They record the channels used, the call sign behavior, the disciplined brevity. They cannot help but imagine the same tank without the same voice, and in that imagination the vehicle shrinks and grows dumber until it is merely a target again. Every field report is also a debate about causes. Did this vehicle die because its armor was inadequate? Or did it die because it was used to do a job that invited death and paid for success with losses? The answer matters for procurement and for tactics. The examiners catalog penetrations and, when possible, reconstruct the shot. They describe the mines that tore bogies free and the angles of attack used by quick and suicidal infantry in close. They are not blind to local successes. They honor them with statistics and sometimes with names. But they also mark the countervailing truth. While a few tanks died spectacularly, many more did their work, left their effects on the map, and either returned for repair or were replaced before the new day's plan had to be rewritten. The factory blueprints may promise invulnerability or elegance. The field reports promise something else. A probability that the mission will be attempted again tomorrow with a tank that looks and acts very much like this one. As the months pass, the warehouses of captured parts in depots and workshops grow to resemble a kind of enemy museum that curators do not have the leisure to arrange. There are mantelets with familiar scuffs, road wheels stacked like coins, transmission housings that smell of oil and urgency, radios with the faint sweetness of burned bakelight. The engineers move through these artifacts with a focus that has to fight off despair, because every solved puzzle seems to breed a bigger one. How do you answer a machine that refuses to be valuable only as a specimen? How do you meaningfully degrade a formation whose power resides in doing ordinary things with great consistency? The field reports, still loyal to the habit of measuring what can be measured, begin to append paragraphs that sound like philosophy. They ask what a design is for when the enemy treats it as a node in a choreography rather than as a sculpture. They ask whether a clever improvement to a gun sight matters if the battery that supports the tank can already be directed by a man with a microphone and a map. Factory blueprints are not useless, they are incomplete. They tell you the machine's intentions, not its biography. The Japanese engineers, having smoked their cigarettes over hulls that were living rooms an afternoon ago and interrogation props this morning, discover that the biography matters more. It matters that the tank's designers anticipated fatigue and failure and cynicism and tried to manage them with bolts, levers, and stencils. It matters that the tank expects to be part of a family and therefore suffers insult better than a lonely genius ever will. It matters that the tank's sins, fires, penetrations, breakdowns, are paid down by processes designed to continue under stress. By the end of this first contact phase, what seemed like a clear indictment has softened into a mixed verdict. The Sherman can be killed, it can be humiliated, but it is seldom silenced for long, and the voice that returns from its radios tomorrow is what the blueprint never warned you about. The argument between field report and factory drawing will continue, as all good arguments do, into the chapters that follow. There we will examine the statistics that powered the enemy's persistence, the choices embedded in ammunition and optics, the interior grace that saved seconds when seconds ruled life and death, and the countermeasures that worked as methods but failed as strategy. For now, it is enough to say that the first intimate encounter with the Sherman replaced contempt with curiosity, and curiosity is the beginning of respect, even when respect arrives too late to change a war. If you asked a crewman what saved his life, he might gesture at the armor that stopped a fragment or at a hatch that swung open quickly enough to spit him back into the filthy air. If you asked an engineer who has been reading diaries of maintenance sergeants and quartermasters, he might give you a stranger answer: schedules, tonnage, kilowatts, and crates. Numbers, the kind that appear boring until you realize they are the only way a large force breathes, began to accumulate around the American medium tank in a way that made it more than steel. They became a field-issued promise that if a vehicle faltered at dusk, there would be a part to replace the thing that failed by dawn. That if a company ate through its ammunition allotment during a frantic afternoon against nested fieldworks, a convoy would disgorge fresh rounds before the next assault window. That if radios crackled with static because a set took a splash of salt water, there was a replacement riding in a truck already ticketed to that unit. This is not romance. It is arithmetic soaked in sweat, and it functioned as a kind of invisible plating wrapped around the tank's very ordinary frame. The factory story is the beginning of the numbers, but only the beginning. Production capacity tells you how many hulls roll out of doors with paint still off-gassing, how many engines sit on pallets, how many gun tubes will be threaded into mantelets next week. More important to a soldier is the middle of that story, where standardized parts and stenciled crates let strangers service a familiar beast without the rituals of guild membership. When a bogey wheel cracks on coral, the wrench that fits it is the same wrench that fits the wheel on a vehicle 3 islands away. The gasket that fails in the tropics is the same gasket cataloged in a depot across the ocean. These repetitions remove friction from the act of remaining dangerous. Japanese engineers, who adored the uniqueness of difficult solutions where they could afford them, did not miss the unglamorous power of repetition. They confronted an enemy that had commoditized competence. Radios sat at the core of this competence. A radio is a fragile thing in a world that hates fragility, but the quantity fielded turned fragility into redundancy, and redundancy into reliability. One set dying did not doom a platoon's coherence. Another set picked up the talk. The net itself, the social fact that tankers expected to hear one another, expected to hear artillery, expected to talk to aircraft, turned into a habit that was worth more than any single tube or coil. A habit cannot be put on a line of a specification sheet, but it can be measured by the difference between a panic and a pivot. The reports that filtered back from beaches and paddies and volcanic ridges, there is a recurring sentence shape that hints at this truth. The unit was checked, the unit was corrected, the unit was reinforced. Those are radio verbs disguised as destiny. Tonnage tells another tale. Fuel moves in rivers that logistics officers map with an intimacy poets reserve for road trips. Oil and gasoline and water have to wedge their bodies through ports, ride past submarines that want to drink them, climb the backs of men who will unload drums at the edge of a lagoon, and splash into steel throats that judge a day's outcome by whether pistons stay happy. The tank at the pointy end is a consumer, and his appetite is not small. The wonder, from the perspective of an engineer who is taught to think of elegant thrift as a virtue, is that the enemy does not blush at appetite. He plans for it, indulges it, and then demands more from the same machines because he knows the meals will arrive. A tank that can expect to be fed treats risky maneuvers as reasonable. A tank that anticipates hunger avoids those maneuvers even when doctrine asks for boldness. Ammunition sits in the same moral economy. The choice to carry a large proportion of high-explosive shells looks different when resupply is an assumption rather than a wish. If you fear running dry, you hoard armor-piercing for the mythical duel. If you expect the next truck to arrive before sunset, you spend, like a professional spends time, on the problem in front of him. Pillboxes and field guns and machine gun nests die when blasted accurately and repeatedly. The gun that posts heroic penetration figures on a test range contributes little if the day's real work is sculpting a path through prepared positions. Japanese examiners followed the scrap and the shrapnel and sighed an unromantic acknowledgement. Those pallets of 75mm shells that rolled off ships in astonishing quantity were translating into hours of practical suppression that doctrine could not overthrow with zeal alone. Spares seem too homely to qualify as strategy until you sit in a depot and watch the moral weather improve when a truck backs up with the right labels on its crates. Belts and plugs and filters are the vocabulary of tomorrow's fight. The tank prefers to be spoken to in those syllables. The Americans spoke fluently, not because they prayed harder, but because their grammar of industry allowed a pronounced future tense. This will be fixed. This will be replaced. This will be done. That confidence wired straight into crew behavior. Men who believe their vehicles will be nursed back to health drive a little harder because the price of a breakdown is not exile. It is an evening with a wrench and a cigarette under a tarpaulin, while a friend hands them the exact bolt they asked for. What then of the argument, honest in its way, that numbers are not courage? It is true. Numbers do not storm a bunker. Yet numbers buy the hours in which courage can be correctly applied, the preconditions for bravery, knowing that the man to your left will still be there in 10 minutes, that your engine will turn over when you have to reposition, that your loader will not fumble because he is not working inside a puzzle box, are numeric. Rate of fire and mean time between failures and gallons per mile and signal strength at a given range seem like bookkeeping until you watch them convert into legs in motion and men who keep their heads enough to do precise violence. Japanese engineers, tallying losses and watching replacements appear like a tide that refused to read their reports, learned to fear numbers as one fears weather. Even repair, the least glorious of martial arts, joined the conspiracy. Recovery vehicles that looked like beetles with steel muscles crawled onto scenes of disaster and hauled bruised hulls back to workshops that were little more than roofed rectangles. There, an economy of time began. Plates were cut and replaced, engines were swapped, track shoes were hammered straight, radio sets were dried and revived. The work did not ask for genius. It asked for steps, for torque settings, for stencils that told a man where to lift. The result was a loop that never quite closed because the front kept moving, but that loop was short enough that a platoon could remember the smells from the last time and misinterpret them as a promise of survival. There is a temptation to treat all this as a digression, as if the story of a tank ought to be a story about metallurgy and ballistics and nothing else. It is not a digression. It is the story. The enemy who put these vehicles into the field understood that average features multiplied by relentless presence win campaigns that a heroic specification loses by absence. The numbers therefore deserve their place beside any discussion of plates and guns. If a depot's ledger books can move a line on a map, then logistics is not a backdrop. It is a weapon system. This arithmetic wore down the opposition's plans. Mines could be laid and laid well, but there had to be enough steel for teeth and enough trained men to place them, and enough radios to knit the traps into a web rather than a set of isolated stings. Ambush guns could be dragged into positions of wicked cleverness, but their shells were finite, and so were their barrels, and so was the time they could remain undetected once a tank with a radio called a battery and the battery called a flight. The number that mattered most in the end was not thickness or velocity, but availability, a percentage that sounds like an accountant's fetish until you realize it means whether a company can fill a line when the plan says it must. The American medium tank, ordinary where connoisseurs wanted it to be grand, accumulated the right percentages. The lesson is stern. In a world that rewards spectacle in peacetime memory, the things that protected the men inside that steel were the things one teaches a child to admire. Crates, schedules, spares, signals. The Japanese engineers, trained to read the poetry of specification sheets and the drama of duels, came to respect this prose. They did not need to love it. They needed only to concede that it bent outcomes away from beautiful intentions toward ugly success. In that concession, there is something like a verdict. The invisible mathematics around the tank made an honest machine into a dangerous one, and danger expressed itself not as a single thunderclap, but as rain that never stopped. The canon of armored myth favors the duel. Two silhouettes framed against a horizon, barrels aligning like accusations, a single round converting distance into truth. In the islands and paddies and volcanic hills where this medium tank earned its biography, the duel occurred, but it was not the central drama. The central drama was the uglier task of unseating fieldworks, scattering crews of light and medium guns that had learned to vanish between shots, and turning fortifications built by patient hands into rubble quick enough for infantry to cross. Firepower mattered not as a boast, but as a tool that matched the work. The 75mm gun, much maligned by those who wanted every turret to host a lance instead of a hammer, proved to be the right tool more often than the wrong one, and the evidence is written into the ground wherever infantry advanced behind its explosions. A shell's life, from case to crater, is a string of problems that either align or do not. The stabilizer helped that alignment even when it earned skepticism from crews trained to distrust movement while aiming. The sights, good rather than perfect, were calibrated to truths that recurred. A gun shield where a machine gun waited, a window slit cut into reinforced concrete, the lip of a trench that hid a gun's muzzle flash. In those seconds when a platoon begged for a breathing space that would last long enough to reorient itself, what mattered was a shell that arrived promptly and approximately where the commander wanted it. The weapon's high explosive round, with a blast and fragmentation pattern tailored by experience rather than by fantasy, turned stubborn positions into temporary ones. Japanese reports, however reluctant to flatter, admit that a few well-placed HE rounds often bought outcomes that a dozen small acts of courage could not. The coaxial and bow guns add their own grammar to the sentence of an assault. Ammunition belts run like lifelines through engagements that would otherwise disintegrate into chaos. Suppression is a prosaic word for a poetic act, making the enemy smaller by making him hesitate. The tank was good at this because its crew was trained to treat the trigger not as therapy, but as punctuation. Short, smart bursts closed doors for an enemy squad, while the main gun negotiated with a bunker. The heavy machine gun on the roof, a high seat from which to write edits into a battlefield, convinced the unwary that movement above parapets was not a safe exercise. None of this impressed a connoisseur of long-range gunnery. It impressed the platoon that survived to tell a story. Terrain conspired to validate these choices. Coral and ash and jungle leaf screens do not invite kilometer-long sight lines. They conspire against them. The lurid promise of a duel at 1,000 meters shrinks to a reality of 70. At that range, a first accurate HE hit that shakes a gun shield loose or dusts a crew with splinters is worth more than a theoretical penetration figure achieved under the indifferent sun of a test field. The enemy that tried to hold a canyon with reverse slope tricks found his tricks briefly dazzling and then briefly insufficient once a tank's radio drew a triangle between the turret, a battery, and an observer with line of sight. The 75mm gun, in that triangle, acted less like a finisher than like an introducer, a polite fist knocking on a door that artillery then tore off its hinges. Ammunition mix tells a story within the story. The crates stacked near captured positions reveal a preference built by experience rather than dogma. High explosive dominates, smoke appears in quantities that announce a doctrine of obscuration and maneuver, and armor-piercing sights like a quiet insurance policy. This policy paid out when needed. Enemy tanks and self-propelled guns were not imaginary, and there were days when the gunner earned the more theatrical satisfaction of a clean shot that ended a rival's impertinence. Yet when the reports were totted up month by month, the percentages refused to flatter the duel. The fights that decided the shape of a beachhead or the survival of a battalion were those where smoke, and a torrent of coaxial fire pushed men out of hides and turned crossroads into places you did not linger. Firepower is not merely a matter of shells and barrels, it is also a matter of cadence inside the turret. The loader's space decides whether the interval between explosions is humane or murderous. Handles that fall naturally to hands decide whether a correction occurs before the enemy recovers his nerve or after. The commander's perch decides whether situational awareness shrinks or expands under stress. In this fighting compartment, ergonomics were not indulgences. They were multipliers of ordnance. Japanese examiners, who could be flinty in their judgments, found themselves listing small mercies that added up to faster cycles. The way rounds could be reached without gymnastics. The way the breech returned to a position that invited the next round. The way the commander could interrupt with an order that the gunner could execute without arguing with his own machine. There is a temptation at this point to apologize for the gun's limits by offering the later 76 mm like a consolation prize. It is unnecessary for understanding why the earlier weapon mattered where it did. The later weapon improved the duel. The earlier solved the central problem more consistently, which was the demolition of path-blocking structures and the forced relocation of men who had dug into the island's unforgiving geology. If the terrain and the enemy had conspired to stage a different play, perhaps the judgment would tilt. But they staged the play they staged, and the role the tank had to play in that script demanded a voice loud and flexible, more than a voice sharp and thin. Coordination crowns this truth. A tank that speaks to artillery, infantry, and aircraft can wield its gun with a confidence that would be suicidal without those friends. The 75 mm round doesn't have to do everything. It has to begin the sentence in a way that the battery can complete or the pilot can underline. Japanese analysts tallying instances where a position held and where it failed grudgingly credited this chorus. A dug-in gun that would have been a nightmare for a platoon alone became a manageable problem when a tank's first 2 rounds found the right spot on a parapet, and the next 20 seconds filled with other people's gifts. The enemy's firepower, in other words, was modular, and the 75 mm was the module that fit most slots. The conclusion is not clever, it is practical. Firepower is not a sculpture to be admired at a distance, but a hand tool to be judged by the cuts it makes in stubborn material. The cuts that mattered most in these campaigns were through timber, earth, and concrete alive with men. The tool that did those cuts fastest and most reliably under the circumstances was mounted in a turret that many would have dismissed as insufficiently glamorous. Japanese engineers learned to resent the lack of glamour less than they resented the consistency with which work got done. A weapon that answers its actual job well embarrasses the theory that wanted a different job to be central. The embarrassment is useful. It keeps future designers honest when the next war asks a different set of questions, and the numbers and crates and radios assign new heroes their tools. There is a way to talk about survivability that mistakes heroism for design. It lists medals and acts as if bravery were a feature you could weld to a hull. The truth, colder and more loyal to the men who climbed into these vehicles, is that survivability begins long before a round strikes. It begins with space to move, with switches that are where a panicked hand expects them, with hatches that have been tested by men who did not trust drawings, with ammunition that is stored not according to romance, but according to chemistry. In this tank, survivability was not a single dramatic trick, but a tapestry of decisions that allowed crews to make the next decision. Japanese engineers, crawling through the aftermath of defeats and victories alike, found that tapestry unsettlingly sensible. Start with space. A loader who can reach his rounds without twisting like a gymnast is a loader who will still be fast on the 50th round when sweat has washed powder grit down his arms and when the air tastes of hot paint. A driver with pedals that invite feet rather than trap them is a driver who will find reverse underfire as if the lever were a thought rather than a guess. The commander's ability to stand, to swivel, to put his eyes where they need to be without granting the enemy an easy target is a form of armor that does not show on blueprints. These things add up to seconds shaved off actions. Seconds, in turn, add up to avoided penetrations, because the shot that would have arrived if a stall lasted half a heartbeat longer never arrives when a tank sidesteps it. Hatches seem like a crude detail until you sit beneath one with gloves that are slick and a heartbeat that has not learned to slow down in danger. The size of the opening, the shape of the handle, the way counterweights and springs conspire to resist or assist, decide whether 3 men make it out or 2. The reports from the field, when they concretely list lives, are unsentimental about this. Tanks that invited exit saved men who became veterans. Those veterans, by the dull logic of numbers, trained replacements better and led platoons more calmly and returned to vehicles with habits that cut future errors in half. Survivability spreads itself through time in those ways, becoming the quiet author of future competence. Ammunition storage changed under pressure of evidence. Early arrangements that stacked propellant and shell too near human bodies proved to be attacks that could no longer be paid once penetrations became common. The shift to wet stowage was the kind of boring triumph that never draws a crowd in a parade and never photographs as well as a new gun. It meant that when the worst happened, the worst did not always continue to happen. Fires smoldered instead of blossoming into pyres. Men crawled away coughing instead of burning. The moral futility of arguing about whether a tank's soul is brave evaporates in the face of a statistic that shows how many crewmen faced tomorrow because someone insisted on treating propellant like a temperamental animal that should be caged in water. Visibility joins survivability, not because it looks brave, but because it prevents surprises from becoming murders. Periscopes and vision slits and cupolas that offered compromise between awareness and safety stopped being abstractions once ambushes were mapped. A commander who can see long enough to tell his driver to cheat left by a meter is a commander who kills the line of sight of an enemy gunner who had been rehearsing a shot all morning. A gunner who can keep the world in view while his sight picture resolves into something shootable loses fewer seconds, and, by losing fewer seconds, experiences fewer disasters. The enemy's cleverness shrinks when the crew's world grows, and this tank was not contemptuous of the crew's world. The argument for survivability widened further when engineers looked at repairability as a way men live. A tank that breaks and stays broken condemns its crew to repeat their first-day mistakes with a new vehicle. A tank that breaks and returns to duty lets the same men, now educated by pain, apply their lessons inside familiar steel. The machine that returns its crew to itself creates veterans who fit their seats like gloves. Those veterans are stubbornly hard to kill. The maintenance philosophy that allowed this, panels that open, components that swap, parts that match, should be listed as a life-saving device alongside armor and fire suppression. It made human beings rare in the ways that matter. Experienced, calm, hard to spook, and better able to pick enemies' patterns out of the foliage before those patterns became terminal. None of this sanctifies the vehicle. It burned when hit badly in the wrong place and time. It could be gutted by a mine that did its job too well, or flanked by a gun crew that had scouted like artists and waited like saints. Survivability does not abolish risk. It relocates it and reduces it. The honest measure is not whether tragedy occurs, but how often it is avoided and how often it is survived. By that measure, the changes adopted under the pressure of combat and the original decisions that gave men room to live combined into an advantage that statistics noticed before pride did. The evaluators who followed this paper trail toward the human beings in the turret had to admit that the vehicle's ordinariness concealed a stubborn generosity. Morale is the last and most treacherous layer in this weave. Men climb into machines differently when they think those machines are indifferent to their fate. They clamber with a stiffness that spreads into their hands and into their eyes and into their decisions. A vehicle that has a reputation for letting you out even when it fails does not simply save lives. It restores seconds inside decisions while the crisis is still gathering itself. The crew that believes in its hatches and in its compartments and in the logic of its storage stands a little taller under the armor and therefore asks a little more of itself when asking matters. Japanese engineers, who understood that war bends men as much as it breaks machines, recorded enough of these truths to conclude that design and dignity had collaborated. If survivability must be summarized without cheating, it is this: the steel and the layout and the procedures joined to give human beings more chances to try again. Trying again is the secret engine of victory. The tank's reputation for being replaceable sometimes hides the more important fact that its crews were salvageable. The difference between a burned hull and a burned unit is the measure of a design's loyalty. Here, the design proved loyal enough, often enough, that men who should have been names on plaques instead became the weary professionals who taught the next crew where to put their feet when the hatch swings, which lever not to grab in panic, and how to count to 2 before speaking on the radio so that fear does not eat the first word. That is not glory. It is something more enduring. If all the virtues already described had been present but the vehicles failed to reach the start line at the appointed hour, their significance would have collapsed into anecdotes. War honors arrivals. Movement, therefore, is not only about speed over flat ground, but about the stubborn ability to make schedules in bad places. The suspension that some dismissed as old-fashioned embraced ruts and coral and ash with a mechanic's intelligence. The gearboxes, chosen for reliability rather than for delicate genius, delivered torque that a driver could feel and trust. Engines that might not win a peacetime contest for fuel economy or specific output started in the morning with the faithfulness of a dog and forgave dust like a friend. Japanese engineers, who might have preferred a sleek diagram to a scuffed traverse of mud, found themselves recording a different kind of excellence, the kind that shows up. It begins with tracks that bite and do not sulk. Rubber-bushed road wheels and shoes designed for easy replacement created a relationship between the ground and the hull that favored persistence over flash. On coral, where edges can chew into steel like teeth, the assemblies absorbed abuse without turning every march into a trail of broken parts. On volcanic ash, where vehicles dig themselves toward embarrassment, the weight distribution and the patience of the suspension kept more hulls floating on top than sinking. In paddies, where a bad choice becomes a cartoon of futility as tracks spin and mud laughs, the torque curve forgave tentative throttle and rewarded calm throttle. This is not romance either. It is the vocabulary of getting somewhere. Cooling and filtration, so often the unglamorous prerequisites for any of the more glamorous functions, earned a disproportionate share of gratitude from crews. Tropical air carries sand, salt, spores, and sullen heat. Engines smothered in such air become weapons for minutes and wreckage for hours. These engines were coddled by ducts and fans and filters that turned villainous air into something a piston could interpret as kindness. Japanese observers, who had walked past other machines that died of asthma in the same climate, took notes about filter access and about the ease with which a man could evict a day's worth of grit from a housing without sacrificing his wrists. The conclusion once again avoided poetry. This system survived the place. March discipline is a social technology that machinery enables or obstructs. The radio keeps columns from accordioning into infuriating gaps. Engines that restart without ritual keep the column from stopping long enough to invite artillery. Track tension that can be adjusted with tools in the kit keeps a maintenance halt from colonizing an afternoon. The tank's design made these social miracles routine more often than temperamental. Units that had every reason to expect delays from weather and from resistance discovered that their machines were not adding cruelty to the day. They responded by demanding more from themselves in return. The result was a battalion that, with depressing regularity from the defender's point of view, reached exactly where it said it would at exactly the time its plan announced. Terrain that detests vehicles also detests predictability. The answer to that is not just toughness, but adaptability. Dozer blades turned some vehicles into their own pathfinders, shaving down the Earth's spite into usable gradients and carving lanes where maps had lied. The presence of these blades announced a philosophy that saw obstacles as tasks rather than as delays. Flamethrower conversions, while morally terrifying, solved certain problems of caves and tunnels with brutal efficiency. The family of variants surrounding the basic hull mattered because it let commanders promise movement through places that doctrine would have written off as too expensive or too slow. Japanese engineers noted with increasing irritation that yesterday's obstacle was tomorrow's road. Endurance streams from all these details into the simple fact of hours driven without catastrophe. A company that covers the ground between two villages with enough fuel to return, and with engines that do not boil, shows up to the firefight in shape. Men who arrive in shape think better. They see the ambush before the ambush sees them. They treat the sudden eruption of an anti-tank gun as a problem to be solved, rather than as evidence that the gods have chosen a side. The vehicles created that mental surplus by declining to become problems themselves after the first hour. This obedience to schedules, this refusal to turn every day into a rescue mission for one's own machinery, was movement's greatest gift to tactics. Recovery completed the circle. The tank that sank, or that took a wound too deep for field medicine, did not compose a funeral alone. It composed a task for specialized peers. The sight of a battered hull being hooked and hauled is an eyesore in the moment and a promise in the aggregate. It tells crews that their comrades are not leaving steel skeletons to litter the approach for months. It tells planners that the same road will be passable tomorrow because the dead weight has been hauled aside. It tells the enemy, who hopes that wreckage will slow the next attempt, that the next attempt will not be delayed by the corpse of the last. Japanese evaluators were too honest to pretend that movement is glamorous. They wrote of speeds recorded on good ground, and of the way the suspension kept gunners from spraying their anger into the dirt when they wanted to place a round precisely. They also wrote of hours. How many in a day before heat exhaustion asked for a pause? How many before a filter begged for help? How many before track shoes wanted attention? The numbers suited the argument they were forced to make. The machine moved enough, on time enough, in places that hated movement, to form the backbone of attacks that depended on the world staying complicated. The world rarely obliged by becoming simple. The tank obliged by pretending it was. Movement, in that sense, is not the triumph of velocity, but the triumph of refusal to be delayed by the ordinary. The medium tank in question refused so often and so successfully that its arrival began to feel like weather. Weather does not ask your permission, it honors schedules of its own. For the defenders who had sketched great V's of anti-tank fires and who had trusted that distance would turn steel into exhaustion, there was an unpleasant revelation. Distance had been colonized by engines and springs and spares and men who had been taught to keep marching even when their brains begged for shade. That revelation has the taste of inevitability, which is the flavor movement hopes to leave on its opponent's tongue. In the end, arrival is the decisive kindness a machine can perform for the men who must risk themselves under its shadow. It transforms plans from wishes into appointments. It transforms courage from a general virtue into a punctual act. The movement recorded in these notes was not heroic by the camera's standards. It was heroic by the calendar's. The tank made good on 1,000 small promises, and, in doing so, made larger promises believable. That is how roads are taken from their owners, and how days are stolen back from the enemy. One kept appointment at a time. Every army learns, and Japanese formations learned fast at the point of contact. Mines appeared in thicker belts, command-detonated charges were rigged to culverts and coconut logs, and ambush guns were sighted on killing lanes rehearsed until crews could recite the range tables in their sleep. Infantry drilled at close attack with satchels and magnetic charges, crawling to flanks under the tank's arc of fire, trusting that courage could close the last meters that mathematics could not. These methods worked, sometimes spectacularly. A clever gun captain with a well-hidden piece could take 2 vehicles from a column before the third found him. A minefield laid with thought, then covered by interlocking small arms, could stall an attack long enough for dusk to rescue the defenders. A satchel placed under a bogey could freeze a company on ground it didn't choose. But winning locally is not the same as winning sustainably. The same shortages that haunted aircraft production and convoy protection stalked anti-armor plans. Mines require steel, explosives, wire, blasting caps, and men trained to lay them in patterns rather than in hopeful lines. Ambush guns want ammunition stockpiles big enough to practice and still fight, surveyors with time to do the geometry, and radios to fold their fire into a larger story. Close attack demands elite, nerve, and repeatable training cycles, yet too often the men who learned the craft died in the act and took their rare experience with them. Even when a belt of obstacles broke a day's timetable, the next day's timetable reasserted itself, because recovery vehicles and engineers treated damage as a shift of labor rather than as fate. The more imaginative countermeasures, improvised explosive devices, deep pits, camouflaged dummy lanes to channel columns into fire, paid dividends only when the enemy's radios failed or when weather honored the ambush more than the plan. Guns that might have rewritten the duel at range entered the field too slowly and in too few numbers to matter where the main work happened. The finest single weapon is still only a point on a map, if transport cannot keep it fed, and the doctrine around it cannot keep it living between shots. Reports that celebrated a killed tank or a captured enemy vehicle are honest. They are also unrepresentative of the larger arithmetic. Time after time, the rhythm of replacement and repair absorbed losses and replaced them with crews who had rehearsed the specific problem that killed yesterday's men. To fight an organism with incidents is to mistake biology for biography. The defenders proved again and again that courage could injure the machine. What they could not prove was that courage could exhaust it. The lesson was not that the countermeasures were foolish. They were often the only rational choice in a tight corner. The lesson was that an opponent who treats availability and communication as weapons will interpret your success as a tactical episode to be studied and outpaced rather than as a strategic checkmate. The gulf between an ingenious minefield on Tuesday and an operationally meaningful delay in June is crossed by logistics, and logistics was where the tank's side had chosen to be brilliant. That brilliance turned an enemy's best days into pauses rather than pivots, and no cleverness can scale if the calendar refuses to cooperate. The enemy's armored story did not arrive in a single, perfect draft. It arrived in revisions. Variants with the 76mm gun climbed into the line when the duel demanded harder answers. Wet stowage displaced old sins because a graph of burned crews said it must. Dozer blades sprouted on hulls that needed to sculpt the ground into something friendlier. Flamethrower conversions appeared, where caves argued that terror, not shrapnel, would pry men from rock. Recovery vehicles multiplied until the sight of one nosing into a wreck began to feel like a ritual rather than a rescue. Field expedients that worked once were written into kits. Failures were retired without ceremony. The process did not fetishize novelty, it fetishized improvement. This pace of change hurt the defender twice. First, it compressed the value of intelligence. A report that captured a weakness in March confronted a different animal in May. The notes that described ammunition stowage hazards or disappointing penetration curves were still true in their moment. They were less true in the moment that mattered to the next fight. Second, it punished procurement cycles that could not turn lessons into metal before the season turned again. Workshops could modify a handful of guns or improvise spaced armor on a platoon's worth of vehicles, but they could not drag an industry forward by grit alone. To watch your enemy shorten the loop between observation and adoption is to watch your own plans grow stale in real time. Iteration also lived below the threshold of new hardware. Crews rewrote their habits with an impatience that only survival teaches. Loader choreography improved until the turret felt like a muscle memory rather than a room. Stabilizers, tolerated at first, earned trust through saves that men did not forget. Radio discipline hardened, brevity codes tightened, and the ad hoc became the standard. Infantry, engineers, and tankers practiced together until their arguments sounded like doctrine. None of this would earn a headline in a factory newspaper. All of it earned space on the map. When a force believes it can change and then proves the belief true every quarter, it begins to fight with the arrogance of improvement and the humility of data, an unsettling combination for any opponent. If iteration sounds like bureaucracy with a new coat of paint, that is because bureaucracy is what keeps iteration from being a slogan. Forms and feedback loops and quartermaster ticks are the rails that carry ideas from the field to the shop and back to the field before memory fades. The machine that shouldn't have worked under the old metric began to feel inevitable because the institution that carried it chose to behave like a living laboratory under fire. You cannot duel that with a single miracle. You can only match it with your own loop, and the hard truth of 1944 and 1945 was that matching was not on offer. Strip away pride and preference, and the verdict writes itself. Judged as a solitary specimen in a duel imagined by romantics, the tank is unexceptional. Judged as the beating heart of a combined arms organism that values availability, communication, and repair as paramount virtues, it becomes something formidable. The most telling lines in the examiner's notes are the ones where technical observation yields to operational implication. A phrase about hatch geometry becomes a prediction about veteran retention. A comment about filter access becomes a forecast about March success in humid heat. A remark about the proportion of high explosive rounds becomes a thesis about how strong points die. The admission that it should not have worked is therefore a confession about the metric used, not about the machine's reality. Expect a duel, and you will be astonished by an army. Expect spectacle, and you will be baffled by persistence. The vehicle's ordinariness was never a disguise. It was a declaration that the war would be fought in the prosaic spaces between accidents and ambitions. Those spaces are where radios are tuned, where crates are labeled, where torques are checked and rechecked, where hatches are tested by hands that remember burns, where loaders learn the choreography of survival. In those spaces, the tank excelled, and excellence there translated ruthlessly into maps that changed color. It is easy to praise singular brilliance. It is harder and more honest to praise systems that keep promises. The notes that began in skepticism end in a kind of respect that is more painful than applause, because respect here implies inevitability, and inevitability is the most demoralizing of enemies. When a machine you once dismissed keeps arriving with friends at the right hour, your catalog of its faults turns into a diary of your own misunderstandings. The verdict is not that the tank was flawless. It is that its flaws were outvoted by a coalition of virtues that counted every minute and every mile and every shell as a chance to try again. The final lesson does not belong to museums. It belongs to planners and operators who must decide what to value when the next fight refuses to resemble the last. The story recounted here insists on a hierarchy. Availability first, communication next, repair close behind, and only then the seductive specifications that look so fine under studio lights. The machine's genius was not the grandeur of any single component, but the reliability with which ordinary components cooperated. It fought as part of a choir that practiced, knew the score, and showed up on time. Modern forms of the same logic are not hard to find. A platform that can be refueled, rearmed, and reset inside the cycle time of an enemy's reconnaissance is a platform that grows fangs out of proportion to its line-item glamour. A formation that treats radios as weapons, maintenance as maneuver, and iteration as doctrine will grind down opponents who bet everything on a handful of stunning performances. The lesson is not an excuse for mediocrity. It is a warning that brilliance must be made common, or it will be outlived by competence. The engineers who wrote these reports did not surrender their taste for elegance. They surrendered their claim that elegance alone could decide outcomes. They learned to count minutes, to respect crates, to take seriously the way a hatch opens and the way a loader moves, to listen to nets as if listening were a kind of artillery. They learned that a tank can be ordinary in silhouette and extraordinary in the calendar it controls. And somewhere in the tired prose of their conclusions sits the most honest compliment an enemy can offer. It worked because it arrived together, again and again, until the map gave up. What endures, then, is not a silhouette or a gun length, but a way of thinking that prefers systems to solos. The vehicle at the center of this story did not win because it was a miracle. It won because it was a promise kept daily by thousands of unphotogenic acts. If there is a single sentence to carry forward, it is this: in war, the tool that looks ordinary but keeps its appointments will beat the tool that looks magnificent but runs late.